Welcome back to the Vault of the Wanderer. I'm a fellow traveler and I'm an alcoholic. Today, I'm deeply grateful that I can honestly say those words because if I hadn't admitted that to myself, I would have blocked myself from the 12 steps that helped me climb out of the dungeon of my own self imposed prison of alcoholism. This episode is being released in August of 2026, which marks 7 years of continuous sobriety for me. Along the way, one of my sponsors shared something with me that has remained in my heart ever since. He told me that we do not accept our sobriety milestones to inflate our ego or to take credit for the miracle our higher power has worked in our lives. We accept them from a place of humility and gratitude. We accept them so that the newcomer can see what is possible. And we also accept them as a reminder to those of us who have been walking this path for many years that the miracles don't stop if we continue working this spiritual program of action. There is always another layer of healing and another layer of freedom, another opportunity to deepen our relationship with our own higher power. Whenever we come to celebrate each other's milestones, we aren't celebrating perfection, we're celebrating transformation. So, today, in the same spirit of gratitude, I'd like to share my experience, my strength, and above all, my hope. I'll briefly tell you what my life was like before sobriety, what happened, and then I will spend most of our time talking about what it's like now. Because in my experience, getting sober wasn't the destination, it was just the beginning. But to understand why that beginning was such a miracle, I first need to take you back to where I came from. For 25 years, alcohol and drugs gradually became the center of my life, and that left me feeling empty inside. This is what our literature refers to as being spiritually bankrupt. For me, it simply meant that I had completely lost touch with who I truly was, and I had absolutely lost touch with divinity. I no longer knew how to live honestly. I didn't know how to sit quietly with myself. I didn't know how to face fear without immediately trying to escape it. I didn't know how to love without attachment or serve without expecting something in return. I didn't know how to be present. Instead, my life revolved around chasing relief through pleasure and avoiding discomfort and pain at all costs. Little by little, I became someone I never imagined I could become. I manipulated people, I lied, I stole, not only from stores, but from the people around me. I stole trust, I stole peace from the people who loved me most. I became the kind of person my family deeply loved, but no longer wanted around because my addiction brought so much chaos and suffering into their lives. As the years went on, I tried everything I could think of to change. I changed substances, I changed relationships, I changed jobs, I changed where I lived. I went to treatment center after treatment center. Each time, I believed that this one would finally be different. Sometimes I'd stay sober for a little while, then I'd relapse. I convinced myself my problem was where I lived, or who I was with, or what I was drinking, or what I was using. Eventually, I realized something. Everywhere I went, there I was. I always took myself with me. By the end of my addiction, my body reflected the chaos that had been happening inside me for years. I weighed nearly 300 pounds. My health was rapidly deteriorating. I was experiencing pulmonary embolisms, pancreatitis. My skin was gray. I had almost lost my left arm due to an abscess. I was pre diabetic, and I was temporarily in a wheelchair after surviving multiple overdoses. Then one day I was revived and my legs did not work. I tried with all of my might to send the signal from my brain to my legs to move, and nothing would work. I'd been admitted to several psychiatric hospitals. I had lost nearly everything addiction had promised me, and I was living on a trap house floor. The very things I had turned to for relief had become the source of my suffering. Then something happened that I never thought was possible. Even alcohol stopped working. The one thing I believed I could always depend upon could no longer numb the fear, the shame, the loneliness, or the pain. At that point, I lost my ability to speak. Not from anything physical, but because I couldn't see how I was going to face the rest of my life without a mind altering substance to soothe my suffering. Looking back, I can see that my higher power wasn't punishing me. Every false refuge was simply being removed, one by one. Not long afterward, on Easter morning, while my parents were away, I injected what I believed was heroin. It wasn't heroin, it was fentanyl. I overdosed. By the time my parents returned home, I was lying lifeless on the bathroom floor. My skin was blue. My father had to force the door open. The paramedics worked to revive me. Later, I learned they told my parents they were going to try one more time. If that didn't work, there was no more they could do. By the grace of my higher power, they were able to revive me. When I opened my eyes, I looked at the paramedics. Then I looked at my parents. The pain on their faces was unbearable. I remember saying, "Get me out of here. I want to kill myself." The truth is, I didn't want to die. I simply couldn't bear witnessing the pain I had caused the two people who loved me most. And because I said those words, I was admitted into a psychiatric hospital. I remained there for at least 3 weeks. Every day, I wondered why they wouldn't let me leave. Finally, I mustered up the courage and I asked the psychiatrist. He explained, "We haven't allowed you to leave because you told the paramedics you wanted to kill yourself." For the first time, I told the complete truth. Not that I wanted to die, but that I couldn't bear witnessing the pain I had caused my parents. The next day, he approved my discharge. I was so relieved. I called my mother and said, "Hey, Mom, they said I can come home tomorrow. What time are you going to pick me up?" There was a long pause. Then she said, "We love you, but you can't come back here." Looking back, I can honestly say that that was one of the greatest gifts I have ever been given. Even to this day, it gives me goosebumps. At the time, it felt like abandonment. Today, I know it was God's grace. A social worker that day handed me a list of state funded treatment centers. I had no money, no insurance, no car, no home, but by the grace of my higher power, there was an opening at a women's state funded treatment center, and that opportunity became the door to freedom. One evening, we were given a choice. We could either go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or stay behind and do housework. Back then, I wasn't looking for recovery. I was looking for an easier option. Going to a meeting sounded a whole lot better than scrubbing toilets or cleaning the house. So I went. Looking back, I can't help but smile. I was lured into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous by my character defect of laziness. But my higher power used that choice to begin my spiritual awakening. That simple decision led me to my home group. I remember walking into that room and feeling completely out of place. People were smiling and they were laughing and they really seemed genuinely happy. And to be honest, it made me really uncomfortable and really angry. I couldn't understand why complete strangers were being so kind to me. Part of me believed that they must want something in return, but I kept coming back because I had nowhere else to go. And quite frankly, no one else wanted me around. I kept showing up day after day, but after nearly 25 years of alcohol and drug abuse, my brain was so fried that when people shared their stories, only bits and pieces made sense. It was genuinely difficult for me to comprehend what they were saying. I was super confused. It felt like everyone was speaking another language. And on top of that, the big book had been written in the 1930s, and a lot of the words didn't make any sense to me. Anytime I tried to read it, I would get tongue tied and my face would turn red. I was so embarrassed, so self-conscious, so afraid of people. I could barely look at anyone in the eye. I always sat in the back row, staring down at the linoleum floor, quietly praying that no one would come talk to me after the meeting. But I kept coming back. I kept pushing past my comfort zone. I kept pushing past my lack of understanding. And little by little, a sentence would make sense. Then another, then another. Over time, the language that seemed so foreign began to feel like home. As I continued coming back, I began hearing people talk about a higher power. At the time, I wanted nothing to do with God, the God that I had inherited from my childhood. I had an entire treasure trove of resentments that I didn't even realize that I had buried. People assured me that I could create my own conception of God. They suggested I could use the acronym GOD, Group of Drunks, or even the Great Outdoors. I loved that flexibility because no one expected me to believe exactly what they believed. And at the time, I chose both. I chose the group of drunks and I chose the great outdoors. I was really selective about who I invited into my corner. More specifically, I chose the elders in my home group. Just a little bit of a backstory. Ever since I was a little girl, I always felt safe around elderly people. Whenever I was around them, I felt calm because they were calm. I loved being around their wisdom, and I always wanted to be under their wing. So, choosing the elders in my home group felt completely natural. I wasn't looking for a certain number of years of sobriety. Some had decades, others had only had a few years. What I was looking for was people with emotional equilibrium, serenity, humility, spiritual depth, people who are actively living the principles of this program, people who strive to be virtuous, people whose lives reflected the kind of life I hoped one day to live. Whenever I didn't know what to do, I called upon those people. That was my GOD. And when I needed peace, I went into nature. I loved the trails, the wildlife, the trees, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. Long before I developed a conscious relationship with my higher power that I have today, both the fellowship and the great outdoors became places of refuge that created an opening. Just a possibility that maybe one day I could trust in something greater than myself. I didn't know if it would work. I just knew I couldn't keep living the way I had been living. At that point, I was desperate enough to try anything. I remember my sponsor telling me that every morning I should get on my knees and say the third step prayer. I was incredibly obstinate. He looked at me and he said, "Humble yourself and get on your knees and pray." I resisted. Then he reminded me, "When we first met, you said you were willing to go to any length. Are you willing?" I said no. He smiled and said, "Then pray for the willingness to be willing." That prayer changed everything. As we continued working the steps, he shared something with me that completely changed the trajectory of my life. He opened the big book and said, "Alcohol is but a symptom." Then he looked at me and said, "Cross out the word drinking and write the word thinking." At first, I didn't know why he had given me that suggestion. I had no idea that those words would become one of the greatest spiritual practices of my life. Whenever I became anxious, afraid, angry, or emotionally disturbed, he taught me to pray, "God, direct my thinking." Around that same time, he also began introducing me to Eastern spirituality. At the time, I didn't understand how any of it fit together. I simply trusted him and I kept practicing. Then a couple of days ago, I was in a meeting. The topic came out of the 12 and 12. They read a passage that stopped me in my tracks. It was funny because I was actually at the trail and I literally stopped walking. And that passage says that when we are emotionally disturbed, we can repeat a particular prayer or phrase that has meaning to us. Simply repeating it over and over helps clear a channel that has become clogged with fear, anger, frustration, or misunderstanding, allowing us to once again seek God's will instead of our own. When I heard those words read aloud, 7 years of practice clicked into place. I realized that my sponsor hadn't been teaching me two different paths. He had been showing me the same timeless spiritual principle from two different traditions. So, what this brings to mind is in Sanskrit, the repetition of a sacred prayer, in Sanskrit, the repetition of a sacred prayer or spiritual phrase is called japa. The prayer itself is called a mantra. The word mantra is commonly understood to mean spiritual protection. I smiled when I learned that because I realized I'd been practicing that principle all along. For me, God direct my thinking became a mantra. Every time I repeated those words, it was like putting up a spiritual dam. Instead of allowing fear, resentment, pride, attachment, aversion, or any other kind of defect to come flooding in, I was able to hear my higher power instead of my ego. What I mean by that is all the negative aspects of the mind were kept at bay. The more I repeated that prayer, the less identified with fear, resentment, pride, attachment, and aversion I became. In other words, the less I took ownership of them. I stopped believing that every fearful, let me say that again. I stopped believing that every fearful thought, every angry thought, every prideful thought, and every craving was who I truly was. Those defects had been creating a barrier between me and my higher power all along. And that mantra helped remove what had always been standing in the way. Little by little, the channel became clear. And as it cleared, I found something I had spent 25 years searching for. Not another drink, not another relationship, not another achievement, but serenity. For the first several years of my sobriety, I thought that recovery was primarily about staying sober. And don't get me wrong, that alone is a miracle. But eventually, I discovered something that changed everything. Removing alcohol wasn't the end of my suffering. Removing alcohol was not the end of my suffering. It simply uncovered it. The obsession to drink was gone, but fear was still there. Pride was still there. Selfishness was still there. The desire to control people and outcomes was still there. The tendency to seek happiness outside of myself remained. I put down the bottle and my higher power removed the obsession. Now, I had to begin removing the ego, the negative aspects of the mind, my attachments, my aversions, and all of the impressions of the past that continued to shape the way I thought, felt, and reacted. That's when prayer and meditation became the foundation of my life. Some mornings I left meditation feeling exactly the same. Other mornings I experienced a peace that words cannot adequately describe. But over time, something much more important happened. I began noticing that I didn't react to life the way I once used to. Situations that once would have me filled with anger became opportunities for self observation. Resentments didn't last as long. The need for approval slowly began losing its grip. Instead of asking, how can I change the world around me? I began asking, what in me needs to change? That shift transformed the direction of my recovery. Instead of trying to control my life, I began allowing life to reveal the parts of me that still needed to die. I came to understand that every person, every inconvenience, every disappointment, and every fear had become part of my spiritual training. At that point in my sobriety, I didn't yet have my own relationship with a higher power. I was still relying on the group of drunks and the great outdoors as my higher power. I was leaning on the wisdom they had gained through their own experience, and I was also borrowing my sponsor's higher power. Then, one night, while I was staying in a sober living home, something happened that I will never forget. It is forever etched into my mind. Just as I was about to drift off into sleep, I heard a voice within me say, "Put your shoes at the foot of the bed, along with your pants and your purse." So I did, and I fell fast asleep. Later that night, the house manager came to my door and shouted that there was a fire. I looked out the blinds and I saw flames almost hitting the back of our privacy fence. I grabbed my shoes, my pants, my purse, and I ran out the front door. The women were yelling at me to come back, but all I could think of was that the condo behind our sober living house could explode at any moment. So I kept running. Our sober living home was at the corner of an access road to a major highway. There was a bridge that crossed over the highway. I ran across that bridge and I just kept running. To this day, I have no idea how I was able to run like the wind at nearly 300 pounds. Then that voice within me spoke again and said, "Take a right down this street." So I did. Then it said, "Now take a left down this driveway." Finally, it said, "Do you see that red door? Knock on it." So I knocked. A man opened the door. It was a technician from the rehab I had been going to. He looked at me and asked, "How did you find this place?" But here's the thing, it was a male, sober living home. I wasn't even supposed to know about this location. That was my first spiritual awakening. After that night, my life went on business as usual, but that experience stayed in the back of my mind because I couldn't afford to dwell on it at the time. I still had an enormous amount of growing up to do, steps to work, service to work to perform, and I had just started a new job. I had no idea how I was going to get all of it done, and it felt like such a daunting task. My body was nearly 40 years old and it was falling apart. On top of that, because of arrested development, emotionally, I was still the 14-year-old girl who had started drinking and using. Sobriety wasn't just teaching me how to stop drinking, it was teaching me how to become an adult for the very first time. The first couple of years of my sobriety were not glamorous. I moved from sober living home to sober living home. I think I moved nearly 13 times during my very first year. For a long time, I didn't have a place that felt like home. I didn't even own a car, and I took the bus everywhere. I walked miles to work in the summer heat. I'd arrive drenched in sweat, change my clothes, and then begin my shift. I was also trying to clean up the wreckage of my past. I didn't have a checking account because I owed so many banks from writing hot checks. I owed government agencies tens of thousands of dollars. But instead of running from those problems like I always had, I started making phone calls. I humbled myself. I told them that I was in treatment. I told them that I was recovering from alcoholism. I admitted I couldn't pay what I owed all at once, and I asked to be on payment plans. I started becoming someone who kept her word. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to escape the consequences of my previous actions. I was learning to face them one day at a time. Something else was quietly changing during those years. The fellowship began trusting me. The same person who had spent years manipulating people was now being trusted with the keys to our clubhouse. I started making genuine friends. I began sponsoring other women. I discovered that one of my greatest gifts of sobriety wasn't receiving help, it was becoming someone who could offer it. My sponsor spent hundreds of hours with me. He taught me far more than how to stay sober. He taught me how to think differently, how to live differently. He introduced me to spiritual traditions from around the world. He taught me that my relationship with my higher power wasn't supposed to be an afterthought. My relationship with my higher power had to become the foundation upon which everything else was built. He taught me that love, tolerance, compassion, and service weren't just beautiful ideas, they were daily practices. Little by little, my life began changing in ways I never thought possible. I finally opened my own bank account. I continued making financial amends. I slowly but surely rebuilt my credit. The fellowship had helped me pack my belongings when I made the decision to move back to my city where I grew up. And for the first time in many years, my parents were genuinely looking forward to having me closer again. I had saved them enough money, rather, better said, I had saved enough money to rent my own apartment. After years of sober living and being in those sober living homes and other shared spaces where privacy and quiet were hard to come by, I finally had a quiet space where I could close the door, sit in silence, and continue building a relationship with my higher power. I found a better job. I continued going to meetings. I continued with my sponsor. I continued praying and meditating. One of the greatest miracles was something I hardly noticed at the time. Right outside of the entrance to the apartment complex was a convenience store that sold alcohol. I could have walked there any day of the week, but the thought simply wasn't there anymore. The obsession had been removed. That wasn't willpower, that was grace. Over the next several years, I continued rebuilding my life one day at a time. In early sobriety, my sponsor suggested that I not date anyone for the first year. When that year came to an end and I asked him, "Well, it's been a year," he said gently, "Why don't you take another year?" 1 year eventually became 4. Looking back, I can see what an incredible gift that was. During that time, I wasn't learning how to find the right person. I was learning how to become the right person. One day, while working through my sex ideal with a sponsor, a female sponsor, by the way, she asked me to write down every quality I had hoped to find in a future partner. When I finished, she looked at me and said something that stayed with me ever since. Everything you desire this person to be, that is what you need to become. Those words changed the way I approached relationships. Instead of searching for someone to complete me, I began transforming myself. I worked to replace selfishness with service, fear with courage, dishonesty with integrity, intolerance with compassion. And little by little, I started becoming the very person I had hoped to meet. About 4 years into my sobriety, I finally entered my first relationship. When it ended, my heart was broken, but this time, instead of reaching for alcohol, I reached for understanding. Rather than asking, how do I make this pain go away? I found myself asking, what is the root of this suffering? That question led me to Mahayana Buddhism and to a local temple. When I first started attending this temple, I was looking for a deeper understanding of suffering. I wanted to understand why my mind clung to pain and past situations, why it became attached, why it resisted, and whether there was a path that led to genuine freedom and transformation. The more I studied, the more I realized that the sincere teachings of the world's greatest spiritual traditions were pointing toward many of the same universal truths, that each had a different language, different symbols, different practices, but they all seemed to be pointing toward total transformation. My longing for union with divinity became stronger than it had ever been, and it reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. As a little girl, I wanted to become a Catholic nun. There was always something inside of me that longed to dedicate my entire life to my higher power, to pray, to study spiritual literature, and to serve suffering humanity. That longing had been buried beneath 25 years of alcoholism and drug addiction, but now it had returned. And the deeper I immersed myself into those teachings, the stronger that longing became. I no longer felt like it was just a passing interest. It felt like a calling. I wanted to dedicate my life to prayer, meditation, studying the sacred scriptures and spiritual teachings of the world's greatest religions, and serving suffering humanity at the same time, especially those struggling with addiction. At the time, I believed my highest expression of that calling was to become a Mahayana Buddhist nun. I began preparing to shave my head and enter the monastic life. The more time that I spent at the temple, the more gratitude I felt for everything it had given me. It helped me heal. It helped me quiet my mind. It helped me deepen my spiritual daily practice. But as time went on, I also began to realize something about myself. My deepest longing wasn't simply to devote my life to one spiritual tradition. It was to spend the rest of my life studying the wisdom found in all of the world's greatest religions, discovering the universal principles they share, and living them through direct experience. As I spent more time at the temple, I began learning more about what the monastic life there actually looked like. And like many people, I had imagined that becoming a nun meant spending nearly all of my time in prayer, meditation, study, and service. But I soon realized that wasn't the reality at this particular temple. The monastics still worked full time jobs because the temple depended upon them to help support it financially. And as I reflected upon that, I realized as I reflected upon that, I realized something unexpected. If I remained in my own apartment, I would actually have more uninterrupted time for prayer, meditation, chanting, studying the scriptures, self reflection, and contemplation than I would have a monastic life there. That realization completely changed my perspective. I began to understand that devotion isn't determined by where I live, it's determined by how I live. My apartment had quietly become my temple. It became the place where I met my higher power each morning, where I prayed, meditated, studied, and where I learned to observe my own mind, where my relationship with my higher power, which I call my innermost self, continued to deepen, and where my life slowly transformed from the inside out. Just as I was beginning to accept that this was the path my higher power had laid before me, something happened that I had never anticipated. One day, while I was at the temple, a man walked through the front doors. At first, I didn't think much of that man. I had spent years building a life that no longer depended on another person. I had worked hard to become emotionally, financially, and spiritually independent. The last thing that I wanted was to begin relying upon someone else for my happiness, financial security, emotional security, or my sense of purpose. I genuinely believed that chapter of my life had come to an end. After about a month, I noticed something. Most people who visited the temple came once and never returned. The services were unlike anything most people had experienced. We chanted in Sanskrit, sometimes for well over an hour, and we would sit together in silent meditation. It wasn't the kind of place usually people just randomly wandered into and immediately felt comfortable. So one evening, my friend, the Venerable Master, and I were standing near the temple window, as we usually did, just waiting to see if anyone would come to practice. I saw that man walking toward the building. I smiled and said, "He's coming back." I remember feeling genuinely surprised. Very few people ever did. As the weeks went on, I couldn't help but notice the sincerity with which he practiced. He approached the chanting, the meditation, and the Dharma with a quiet humility that caught my attention long before we had ever had our first conversation. Not long after that, we had just finished group meditation, and I was carefully folding my robe. Out of my peripheral vision, I noticed him walking toward me. I remembered smiling quietly to myself. Then he introduced himself for the very first time. He told me the Venerable Master had mentioned I was in recovery, and then he said, I go to meetings too. He mentioned that he was planning to attend a 7 o'clock meeting the following morning. I smiled and said, if you'd like some company, I'd be happy to join you. The next morning, we met at the meeting. Afterward, we went out for breakfast. As we were talking, he asked me a question I'll never forget. He asked, would you be interested in reading the Bhagavad Gita together? Without hesitation, I said yes. His face immediately lit up. What he didn't know was that years earlier, my very first sponsor had encouraged me to read the Bhagavad Gita. And for whatever reason, I had never picked it up. I wasn't sure what translation to read, and I suppose the timing simply hadn't been right. Looking back, I can't help but smile. What my sponsor had planted years ago began to blossom in the most unexpected way. Reading the Bhagavad Gita together became our very first date. From that day forward, our relationship unfolded very differently than anything I had ever experienced before. Every time we met, our conversations naturally gravitated toward things we both cared about most. We studied the Bhagavad Gita together. We talked about Buddhism, esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, dream yoga, and astral travel, the 12 steps, prayer, meditation, the nature of suffering, the purpose of life, and the universal principles woven throughout the world's greatest spiritual traditions. For the first time, I wasn't building a relationship around chemistry alone. I was building one upon shared values, shared practice, and shared longing to know our higher power more deeply. As our friendship gradually became something more, I remained cautious. The wounds from my past had taught me not to confuse attachment with love. I brought the relationship into prayer, into meditation, into self observation. I kept asking my higher power to show me where my motives were unpure, where fear was hiding, and whether I was seeing clearly. Slowly, I realized something beautiful. The relationship wasn't pulling me away from my spiritual life, it was drawing me deeper into it. We encouraged one another to practice, to study, to meditate, to become better people. For the first time, I experienced what it was like to walk beside someone whose deepest aspirations wasn't centered in worldly success, but on inner transformation. Looking back, I can see that this relationship didn't replace my relationship with my higher power. It strengthened it, and that made all the difference. I realize now that my higher power didn't ask me to abandon my deepest calling. It simply gave that calling a different form. Instead of entering a monastery, my higher power opened a different door. Within just a few months, we became engaged. Not long afterward, we made the decision that continues to shape our lives today. We chose to devote our lives to one another and, above all, to devote our lives to our higher power. We wanted our home to become a place of prayer, study, and practice, a training ground where we could work on ourselves so that we could better serve suffering humanity. As our relationship continued to grow, he gave me an extraordinary gift. He wanted me to have the freedom to devote my life to this calling rather than needing to work outside our home. It was a gift that humbled me deeply. My apartment had quietly become my temple. Now our home had become our temple. It became the place where we prayed, where we meditated, where we studied, where we continued transforming ourselves side by side. Looking back, I can see now that my higher power was quietly fulfilling my deepest longing of my heart, just in a way I could never imagined. Over the years, my understanding of the miracle continued to evolve. At first, I thought the miracle was that alcohol had been removed from my life, and it certainly was, but it just wasn't the alcohol. The obsession to drink and use other mind altering substances had also been removed. That alone was a miracle beyond anything I could have accomplished through willpower. But eventually, I began to realize that alcohol had never been the deepest problem. It had simply been the most obvious symptom. As one addiction disappeared, another quietly tried to take its place. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes it was pride, sometimes it was the need for approval, sometimes it was attachment, sometimes it was aversion. The object the object of my craving had changed, but the mechanism had not. That realization changed the way I understood recovery. I came to see that recovery wasn't simply about removing alcohol, it was about learning to recognize anything that had the power to block me off from my higher power. Over time, I began to understand that freedom simply wasn't the absence of alcohol. Freedom was the gradual removal of everything that stood between me and my higher power, not just addiction to alcohol and drugs, addiction to vanity, fear, pride, selfishness, resentment, the need to control, the need for approval, the need for certainty, attachment, aversion. When one by one my higher power began revealing them to me, not so I would condemn myself, but so I would become free from them. I slowly realized that every difficult person, every disappointment, every fear, every resentment, and every unexpected circumstance was revealing another part of myself that still needed to be transformed. And that's when I realized the world had become my mirror. I also began to understand that transformation wasn't something I achieved once. It was something I had to choose again and again every single day. Some days I got it right, Some days I didn't. But even on those days, I discovered something remarkable. There was always an invitation to begin the day again. It didn't matter if it was 8 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night. At any moment, I could simply begin again. That realization removed a tremendous burden. I no longer felt like I had to become perfect. I simply had to remain willing to observe myself, willing to admit where I was wrong, willing to make amends, willing to go and make any amends that were necessary, and willing to let go of whatever was standing between me and my higher power. That willingness continues to transform my life one day at a time. As I continue walking this path, I've come to believe that the goal was never simply to stop drinking. The goal was to awaken spiritually, to awaken from the unconscious patterns that had been running my life for decades, to awaken from fear, to awaken from resentment, to awaken from selfishness, to awaken from attachment, from the illusion that lasting peace could ever be found outside of myself. Today, my spiritual practice is no longer something I do because I'm afraid of drinking or using again. I practice because I don't want to fall spiritually asleep again and go into spiritual amnesia. I don't want to lose conscious contact with my higher power. I want to keep removing whatever stands between us. And every time another layer falls off, I discover that the peace I was searching for was never something I had to create. It was something that had been here all along, waiting patiently beneath the noise of my own mind. The beautiful part is that this understanding didn't come from reading another book. It didn't come from collecting more spiritual concepts. It came from living, from making mistakes, from suffering, from praying, from meditating, from observing my own mind, and from gradually discovering that my higher power has been using every one of those experiences to transform me from the inside out. Looking back over the past 7 years, I can honestly say that almost nothing has unfolded the way I expected it to. Some doors closed that I desperately wanted to stay open, others open that I never would have chosen for myself. Yet every one of them led me exactly where I needed to be. Each experience invited me to let go of another part of myself that had been standing in the way. I've come to trust that process, not perfectly, but more deeply than I ever thought possible. If there's one thing these past 7 years have taught me, it's that my higher power has always been more interested in transforming me from the inside out than changing my external circumstances to fit my own plans and designs. For years, I kept asking myself, why is this happening to me? Today, I find myself asking a very different question. What is this trying to teach me? That single shift has changed the way I experience life. Problems no longer feel like interruptions, they become invitations. Every fear invites courage, every resentment invites forgiveness, every attachment invites surrender, every disappointment invites acceptance, every difficult person invites self observation, compassion, and the letting go of resistance. The circumstances themselves are no longer my greatest concern. My state of consciousness is, because I've learned that I can experience peace whether my circumstances change or remain exactly the same. And to me, that is one of the greatest miracles of all. If you're listening today and you're struggling the way I once struggled, I want you to know something. I spent years believing that I was beyond help, that I was simply too far gone, that I had caused too much damage, that there was no way back. I was wrong. The same higher power that carried me through addiction, through treatment, through recovery, through heartbreak, and through every season of transformation since then is still guiding me today. He has always been there. I was simply learning how to attune myself to spiritual guidance. That is what recovery has been pointing me toward all along, removing everything that was preventing me from uncovering who I truly was. 7 years later, I've lost nearly 150 pounds. My life is no longer riddled with diseases that once consumed my body. My family trusts me again. They don't wonder where I am. They don't wonder whether I'm still alive. They genuinely enjoy having me in their lives. I married my best friend today, and together we've built a home centered around prayer, meditation, study, and spiritual practice. Our home has become our temple, a training ground where we can work on ourselves so that we can better serve suffering humanity. My life is no longer driven by excessive consumerism, vanity, or the endless pursuit of trying to fill a void that only my higher power could ever fill. Today, my life is centered around prayer, meditation, study, spiritual practice, and service. That way of life has transformed me, and it continues to transform me every single day because I became willing to surrender, willing to observe myself, willing to keep taking the next right action one day at a time. Before I close, I want to express my deepest gratitude. First, to my higher power. Thank you for your love, your compassion, your patience, and your willingness to show me the way out of the dungeon of alcoholism and addiction. To Alcoholics Anonymous, thank you for opening your doors to a frightened, broken woman who had nowhere else to go. To Bill W., Dr. Bob, and the countless men and women who came before me, thank you for carrying this message so that people like me could have another chance at life. To every sponsor, every home group, every person, whoever made the coffee, set up the chairs, greeted me as a newcomer, shared honestly, or quietly served behind the scenes. Thank you. You may never know how profoundly your acts of service changed my life. And finally, thank you for spending this time with me, for allowing me to share my experience, my strength, and my hope. If you're struggling today, please don't give up. Keep showing up, keep praying, keep meditating, keep seeking, keep taking the next right action. There is always another layer of healing, another layer of freedom, and another opportunity to deepen your relationship with your higher power. Until next time, I wish you peace, I wish you clarity, and I wish you the courage to continue walking the path that has been laid at your feet. Thank you for listening.